Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently onto the windswept plains of southern England, where massive stones stand in a circle beneath endless skies, holding secrets that span 5,000 years of human wonder, devotion and mystery. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through vanished worlds that time tried to erase but couldn't quite forget. We walk among megaliths raised by hands that worked without metal tools or written language, yet created something so precise, so enduring, that it still marks the turning of seasons and the passage of celestial bodies overhead. We stand where Neolithic communities gathered at midsummer dawn and midwinter dusk, watching light flood through stone doorways in moments of profound connection between earth and heaven, between the living and their beloved dead. Each episode here isn't just about dates and ruins. It's not about memorizing construction techniques or the tons of rock transported across impossible distances. It's about the lives lived, the astronomer priests who tracked the sun's journey across the year, the families who carried their cremated ancestors to rest within the sacred circle, the children who watched stones being raised with ropes and timber and the sweat of hundreds, wondering what their grandchildren's grandchildren would think when they stood in this same place generations hence. It's about the beauty they created, the mysteries they left behind, the questions that still whisper across the centuries, waiting patiently for us to listen, to wonder, to remember. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive, help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. 5,000 years ago, before the great stones stood against the sky, the Salisbury Plain was already a sacred place. The land rolled in gentle waves of grassland, broken by rivers that cut silver paths through chalk downs, their waters reflecting clouds that drifted slow and heavy across horizons that seemed to stretch forever. This was southern Britain in the Neolithic age, a world where small farming communities had begun to settle after millennia of following game and gathering wild harvests, a world where people first understood that the earth could be tended, that seeds planted in spring would yield grain in summer, that life could be something more than endless wandering. The people who lived here in those distant centuries were not primitive in the way we sometimes imagine. They wove cloth and made pottery decorated with intricate patterns. They raised cattle and pigs, ground grain into flour, brewed drinks from honey and herbs. They buried their dead with ceremony and care, understanding that death was not an ending but a transformation, a passage into another kind of existence that required respect and remembrance. Their homes were timber structures with thatched roofs, clustered in small settlements where extended families shared labour and stories, and the warmth of central hearths on cold nights when darkness came early and lasted long. But what set this place apart, what made this particular stretch of plain different from countless other river valleys and grasslands across Britain, was the way people gathered here. Even before the first stones were raised, this landscape drew communities from distant regions. They came for seasonal festivals, for marriages and alliances, for ceremonies that marked the solstices when the sun reached its furthest points north and south before turning back. They came to honour their ancestors, whose bones and ashes were kept in earthen mounds and timber structures that dotted the plain like islands in a sea of grass. The sky above this place was different then, unpolluted by the glow of cities, unmarred by the trails of aircraft or the hum of electric light. At night, the stars appeared in such density and brilliance that the Milky Way cast shadows, and the movements of moon and planets across the celestial sphere seemed less like distant abstractions and more like presences, like gods or ancestors travelling their appointed paths. These people watched the sky with attention we can barely imagine now. They noticed that the sun rose and set at different points on the horizon throughout the year. They saw that the moon followed complicated patterns, sometimes high, sometimes low, sometimes full, sometimes dark. They understood that these movements were not random but followed rhythms, cycles that repeated with remarkable precision. And so they began to mark these cycles, at first with timber posts set in the ground to sight the rising sun at midsummer, later with earthen banks and ditches that created circular enclosures, gathering places where hundreds could assemble to witness the sky's performance. These early monuments required organisation, cooperation, the ability to convince communities to contribute labour not for immediate survival, but for something more abstract, something spiritual and communal. It required belief that the effort was worth making, that creating a permanent marker of celestial events would benefit not just the living but generations yet unborn. This was the world into which Stonehenge would be born, not suddenly but slowly, evolving over 15 centuries from simple earthworks to the iconic stone circle we recognise today. But before any of that could happen, before the first bluestones were carried from distant mountains, or the first Sarsen megaliths were raised against the sky, there had to be this, a community that looked up at the heavens and decided that what they saw there mattered enough to mark in earth and wood, and eventually in stone that would outlast empires, religions, languages, and the very memory of those who built it. The Salisbury Plain waited, patient and eternal, for the work to begin. Stonehenge was never truly lost. Unlike buried cities or monuments swallowed by jungle, the Great Stone Circle stood visible on the plain for 5,000 years, weathering every age that passed. Medieval pilgrims saw it and wondered. Tudor antiquarians sketched it and speculated. Georgian travellers visited it on their grand tours and carved their names into the ancient stones, adding their own small marks to layers of history. But understanding Stonehenge, truly comprehending what it was and when and why it came to be, that discovery took centuries of patient investigation and would not be complete even now. The first serious attempt to study the monument came in the 1600s, when King James I asked his architect Inigo Jones to investigate the mysterious ruin. Jones arrived with measuring tools and artistic sensibilities, convinced he would find evidence of classical Roman design. He measured the stones, drew careful plans, and concluded confidently that Stonehenge must be a Roman temple, perhaps dedicated to the god Coelus. The geometry seemed too perfect, the scale too grand, for ancient Britons whom he imagined as painted barbarians incapable of such sophistication. His conclusion was wrong, but his method, the careful measurement and documentation, set a precedent that later investigators would follow. John Aubrey, another 17th century antiquarian, walked the site with different eyes. He noticed shallow depressions in the ground just inside the earthwork bank, circular pits that formed a ring around the stones. These would later be called the Aubrey Holes in his honour, and modern excavation would reveal they once held cremated human remains, making them some of the earliest features of the monument. Aubrey also proposed a theory that would persist for centuries, the idea that Druids, the priestly class of Iron Age Celts, had built Stonehenge as a temple. It was a romantic notion that captured imaginations despite being wrong by more than 2,000 years. The Druids arrived in Britain around 500 BC. Stonehenge was already ancient when they first saw it, built by people whose names and languages had been forgotten long before Celtic tribes crossed the Channel. The 18th century brought more visitors, more theories, more wonder. William Stukeley, a physician and clergyman, conducted extensive surveys and proposed that Stonehenge aligned with the midsummer sunrise, an observation that proved remarkably accurate. He too believed in the Druid theory, but his careful documentation of the monument's layout and surrounding landscape features provided invaluable records for future archaeologists. He noticed the avenue, a processional pathway that approached Stonehenge from the northeast, aligned with the solstice sunrise. He documented nearby burial mounds and earthworks that suggested Stonehenge was not an isolated structure, but part of a much larger sacred landscape. Yet for all this attention, no one in these early centuries understood the monument's true age. Without scientific dating methods, investigators could only guess based on style and classical references that often led them astray. Some thought it was built by Phoenician traders, others attributed it to Saxons or Danes. A few even suggested Merlin had raised the stones by magic, a legend that reflected how impossible the construction seemed when attempted with the tools available to medieval and early modern observers. The real breakthrough came with 20th century archaeology. In 1901, a Sarsen stone fell during a storm, and the site's custodians hired archaeologist William Gowland to supervise its re-erection. Gowland seized the opportunity to excavate around the fallen stone's base, discovering antler tools that had been used as picks to dig the stone hole. He found no metal artifacts, no Roman pottery, nothing that suggested classical civilization. The tools were Neolithic, made by Stone Age people who somehow organised the labour and engineering required to transport and raise stones weighing dozens of tons. Later excavations in the 1920s and 50s by archaeologists like William Hawley and Richard Atkinson revealed more layers of the monument's history. They found evidence that Stonehenge had been built in stages over many centuries. They discovered that the smaller bluestones came from the Preseli Mountains in Wales, transported somehow across 200 miles of rough terrain. They uncovered cremated human remains, suggesting the site served as a cemetery for elite families over many generations. They documented post holes, stone holes, ramps, and packing materials that told stories of construction techniques and ritual practices. And with the development of radiocarbon dating in the mid-20th century, scientists could finally answer the question that had puzzled observers for centuries. Stonehenge was not Roman or Druidic or Saxon. It was older, far older than anyone had imagined. The earliest earthworks dated to around 3000 BC, making the monument contemporary with the pyramids of Egypt, and older than the great cities of Mesopotamia. The stone circles were raised between 2600 and 2000 BC, during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, by communities that left no written records but spoke eloquently through their monuments. The discovery of Stonehenge, then, was not a single moment but a gradual awakening, a process of learning to see what had always stood in plain sight, learning to read the language of stones and earth, and careful astronomical alignments that still function after 5,000 years. When early investigators first attempted to understand Stonehenge, their responses range from awe to bewilderment to outright disbelief. The monument challenged every assumption about who could build such things and when and why. For scholars steeped in classical learning, for minds that understood sophistication as something that flowed from Greece and Rome, the idea that Stone Age Britons, people without writing or metal tools or classical education, could raise such a structure seemed impossible, and so they reached for explanations that made sense within their worldview, even when those explanations contradicted the evidence lying in plain sight. Inigo Jones's insistence that Stonehenge must be Roman spoke to this need for familiar explanations. Romans built grand monuments. Romans understood geometry and proportion. Romans had the organisational power and engineering knowledge to accomplish such feats. Therefore, Stonehenge must be Roman, regardless of the absence of Roman artefacts, Roman building techniques, or any historical mention of Roman construction at the site. Jones was not a fool. He was a brilliant architect whose work helped introduce Palladian design to England, but he could not imagine that his own ancestors, ancient Britons whom classical sources described as painted warriors and savage tribes, possessed the knowledge and determination to create something this magnificent. The Druid theory that emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries proved more persistent, partly because it was more romantic. Druids occupied a special place in the British imagination, mysterious priests who worshipped in sacred groves, who understood the secrets of nature, who stood as a link to a Celtic past that seemed noble and mystical compared to the harsh realities of Industrial Revolution England. Writers and poets embraced the idea of Stonehenge as a Druid temple. Artists painted imagined ceremonies with white-robed priests raising their arms at sunrise. The theory satisfied a cultural hunger for native British greatness that predated Roman conquest, even though it was wrong by millennia. Yet skepticism persisted. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, some scholars pointed out the problems with prevailing theories. If Romans built Stonehenge, why did no Roman author mention it? Why were there no Roman coins, no pottery, no inscriptions? If Druids built it, why did Celtic Iron Age sites elsewhere in Britain look nothing like Stonehenge? Why would a monument so obviously aligned with solar events contain no mention in surviving Druidic traditions recorded by later observers? These questions had no satisfactory answers, but neither did the alternative, that prolific communities organised massive construction projects spanning many generations. Common people who lived near Stonehenge held their own beliefs, passed down through folklore that sometimes preserved odd kernels of truth. Local legends claimed that the stones could not be counted, that each attempt would yield a different number, a story that might reflect the monument's complex history of standing stones, fallen stones, removed stones, and buried stones that made accurate counting difficult. Other tales said the stones had healing properties, that chips of stone could cure ailments, a belief that led to centuries of visitors breaking off fragments as souvenirs. Some stories claimed that at midnight the stones would come alive, would walk down to nearby rivers to drink, or would dance in circles. These were not scientific theories, but they captured something true about the monument's mysterious power over human imagination. The 19th century brought new tools for investigation and new reasons for skepticism. Geologists examined the stones and determined they came from different sources, some local, some from distant Wales. This raised uncomfortable questions. How did Neolithic people move stones weighing up to 50 tons without wheels, without metal tools, without draft animals large enough to pull such weights? Some scholars proposed that glaciers had carried the bluestones naturally to the Salisbury Plain, that ancient builders simply used what they found lying about. This theory persisted despite lack of evidence for glaciation reaching that far south, because it seemed more plausible than the alternative, that humans had transported the stones deliberately. Excavations in the early 20th century finally provided evidence that began to shift scholarly consensus. The stone tools found during excavations could be dated. The cremated remains could be analysed. The construction techniques could be compared with other Neolithic monuments across Britain and Europe. Slowly, reluctantly, the academic world began to accept that Stonehenge was indeed a product of the Neolithic, built by farming communities who organised their labour around something more important than immediate survival, around beliefs and practices that required permanent monuments to mark time and honour the dead and connect earth with sky. But acceptance brought new mysteries. If Neolithic people built Stonehenge, what drove them to such extraordinary effort? What beliefs could motivate generations of labour? What kind of society could organise and sustain such projects without writing, without complex bureaucracy, without the institutional structures that Egyptians and Mesopotamians used to build their monuments? These questions invited speculation, and speculation invited new skepticism. Every theory about Stonehenge's purpose, astronomical observatory, temple, healing centre, burial ground, brought objections and alternatives. The first response to Stonehenge's true age was thus not simple wonder, but a complex mixture of fascination and doubt, of reverence for ancient achievement and difficulty accepting that achievement without imposing modern assumptions about what constitutes civilization and sophistication. The monument challenged then, and challenges still our tendency to underestimate our ancestors, to imagine progress as a straight line from primitive to advanced, to forget that intelligence and creativity and spiritual depth are human constants that transcend technology and writing, and all the markers we use to measure worth. The legends that swirled around Stonehenge for centuries told stories very different from what archaeologists would eventually discover, yet sometimes those legends contained fragments of deeper truths, memories distorted by time but not entirely invented. The contradictions between mythical origin stories and scientific evidence created a tension that still shapes how we understand the monument, a push and pull between romantic imagination and archaeological fact, between the stories people wanted to believe and the harder truths revealed by careful excavation. Medieval chroniclers wrote that Merlin raised the stones by magic, transporting them from Ireland, where giants had originally built them using stones from Africa. The story appears in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, written in the 12th century. In Geoffrey's account, King Aurelius Ambrosius wished to create a memorial for British nobles slain by Saxon treachery. Merlin advised bringing the giant's ring from Mount Killarras in Ireland, stones possessing healing powers. When human strength failed to move them, Merlin used his arts, and the stones flew through the air to England, where they were re-erected as Stonehenge. The legend is fantasy, but it preserves interesting details. The recognition that stones came from far away, that their transport required extraordinary effort, that the monument served as a memorial for the dead, that healing and ritual significance attached to the stones. Another persistent legend claimed that the devil built Stonehenge, or that he bought the stones from a woman in Ireland and dropped them on Salisbury Plain, where they stood ever after. In one version, a stone fell on a monk who tried to prove the structure was not supernatural, hiding his body beneath. This stone, called the heel stone, still stands outside the main circle, leaning at an angle as if dropped carelessly. These demonic origin stories reflected medieval Christian discomfort with pagan monuments, the need to attribute pre-Christian structures to dark forces rather than acknowledge sophisticated ancestors who worshipped differently. Local folklore insisted the stones could not be counted, that any attempt would yield different results, that the stones themselves resisted human understanding. Some versions said that anyone who counted them correctly 3 times would die or go mad. Others claimed that at certain times of year, the stones would uncount themselves, would shift positions overnight so that yesterday's tally became invalid. Modern visitors often report that counting the stones is indeed difficult, partly because some have fallen, partly because defining what counts as a distinct stone versus a fragment becomes arbitrary, partly because the monument's complex history of construction and modification resists simple enumeration. The legend captured a real experience of confusion and difficulty, translating it into supernatural resistance. Healing properties featured prominently in Stonehenge legends. Medieval people believed that scrapings from the stones mixed with water could cure various ailments. This belief persisted for centuries, leading to significant damage as visitors chipped away pieces. The stones were said to cure wounds, ease childbirth, ward off evil spirits. Pilgrims would touch them, seeking miraculous intervention. In some accounts, water poured over the stones gained healing powers, echoing ancient practices of ritual bathing or anointing with blessed water. These legends might preserve memories of Neolithic beliefs, or they might simply reflect universal human tendency to attribute power to mysterious ancient structures. The reality discovered by archaeologists contradicted these colourful stories, but revealed something equally remarkable. The stones were not placed by magic, but by human hands using timber rollers, rope, earthen ramps, and incredible determination. They did not come from Ireland, but from Wales, transported either by sea and river routes, or dragged overland, a journey requiring months or years. The monument was not built by Merlin or devils or giants, but by Neolithic communities who passed the work from generation to generation, completing over 15 centuries what no single lifetime could achieve. Yet the legends were not entirely wrong. The stones did come from far away, just as stories claimed. The monument was indeed a place of death and remembrance, filled with cremated remains of people buried with ceremony and care. The site held ritual significance related to healing and transformation, though not through magic but through complex beliefs about death and rebirth, about ancestral power and cosmic order. The astronomical alignments were real, marking solstices with precision that required sophisticated observation and mathematical understanding. The contradiction between legend and reality thus becomes less sharp when examined closely. The legends preserved what people sensed about Stonehenge, that it was ancient beyond reckoning, that it required superhuman effort, that it served purposes beyond ordinary understanding, that it connected earth and sky and living and dead in ways that demanded respect and wonder. The legends failed in literal details but succeeded in capturing emotional and spiritual truths that dry archaeological reports sometimes miss. Modern scholarship tries to honour both, to acknowledge the romance and mystery while pursuing factual understanding, to recognise that Stonehenge was built by real people who laughed and wept and loved and died, who worked with stone and timber and sweat, who gazed up at stars and wondered about their place in the cosmos, who needed no magic or giants or devils to accomplish something extraordinary, because they themselves were extraordinary, capable of vision and dedication, and collective effort that built monuments outlasting kingdoms and languages and the very memory of their names. The contradiction teaches us that truth comes in different forms, that legends speak to human needs for meaning and connection, that facts alone cannot capture why Stonehenge matters 5,000 years after the last stone was raised. For centuries, scholars have proposed conflicting theories about Stonehenge's purpose, each explanation reflecting the intellectual fashions and cultural preoccupations of its era. The debates reveal as much about how humans construct meaning as they do about the monument itself, showing how each generation looks at ancient stones and sees reflected back its own questions and obsessions. The truth is likely more complex than any single theory suggests, a layering of purposes that evolved over the monument's 1,500-year construction period, serving different needs for different generations who modified and adapted what their ancestors began. The astronomical observatory theory gained prominence in the 20th century, particularly after Gerald Hawkins published his book Stonehenge Decoded in 1965. Hawkins, an astronomer, used computer analysis to demonstrate that the monument's major alignments corresponded with significant solar and lunar positions, midsummer and midwinter solstices, extreme points of the moon's complex 18.6-year cycle. He proposed that Stonehenge functioned as a kind of Neolithic computer, allowing priests to predict eclipses and calculate calendrical events with remarkable precision. The theory appealed to modern minds comfortable with technology and mathematical sophistication. It seemed to elevate Neolithic people to a status approaching our own, proving they possessed intellectual capabilities we could recognize and respect. Critics pointed out problems with the computer theory. While the major alignments are undeniable, the summer solstice sunrise viewed through the entrance perfectly, many of Hawkins's more elaborate calculations required stretching evidence, finding patterns that might be coincidental. More fundamentally, the theory assumed that Neolithic people separated astronomy from religion in ways that we do now, that they studied the sky scientifically rather than experiencing it spiritually. Modern cosmology treats celestial bodies as physical objects following natural laws. Ancient people likely saw gods, ancestors, forces of life and death playing out their eternal dramas overhead. The distinction between observatory and temple might be meaningless, the astronomical alignments serving ritual purposes that transcended mere timekeeping. The healing temple theory emerged from excavations revealing that many people buried at Stonehenge showed signs of injury, disease, or physical trauma. Some archaeologists propose that the site functioned as a Neolithic Lourdes, drawing pilgrims seeking miraculous cures. The bluestones from Wales were thought to possess healing properties, their special powers motivating the enormous effort required to transport them. Legends of healing stones persisted through medieval times, and chemical analysis showed the Welsh source area had springs once considered medicinal. The theory gained support from evidence of cremated remains showing signs of disease, and from the presence of exotic artifacts suggesting visitors from distant regions. But other scholars questioned whether evidence of sick or injured people proved healing was the primary purpose. Perhaps those who died during pilgrimages were cremated and buried at the sacred site. Perhaps high-status families brought their dead from far away because burial at Stonehenge conferred prestige or spiritual benefit. The healing theory could not explain the complex astronomical alignments, or the monument's evolution through multiple construction phases that changed its layout significantly. The ancestor worship center theory proposed that Stonehenge primarily served as a cemetery and memorial for elite families, a place where the dead could watch over the living and maintain connection with their descendants. The cremated remains found in the Aubrey holes and elsewhere supported this view, suggesting the monument began as a cremation cemetery around 3000 BC. The later stone circles might have served as a kind of temple where the living could gather to honor ancestors, particularly at solstices when the boundary between worlds grew thin and communication with the dead became possible. This theory explained why construction continued for so long, each generation adding to the memorial, expanding it, adapting it to evolving beliefs. Some scholars combined theories, proposing that Stonehenge was all of these things at different times or simultaneously. It could mark astronomical events important for agricultural timing, while also serving as a cemetery and temple. The solstices might matter not just for planting schedules, but because those liminal moments when the sun turned back in its course were times when the veil between living and dead grew transparent, when ancestors could return to receive offerings and grant blessings. Recent theories emphasize the monument as a gathering place, a center where dispersed Neolithic communities assembled periodically for festivals, ceremonies, marriages, alliances. Analysis of animal bones found at nearby settlements suggests great feasts where hundreds or thousands shared food and drink. The effort of building Stonehenge might itself have been a form of ritual, the gathering and working together serving to create social bonds as important as the finished monument. This theory aligns with evidence from other Neolithic sites across Britain and Europe, suggesting widespread tradition of communal construction projects that united farming communities who otherwise lived in small isolated settlements. The debates continue, each excavation revealing new evidence that supports some theories while complicating others. Modern archaeologists generally avoid claiming any single purpose, recognizing that Stonehenge served multiple functions over its long history, that its meaning evolved as beliefs changed, that reducing it to one explanation oversimplifies the sophisticated spiritual and social world of Neolithic Britain. The monument was built by people as complicated as we are, capable of holding multiple meanings simultaneously, understanding that a place can be cemetery and temple and observatory and gathering ground, that marking midsummer sunrise matters both for practical calendar keeping and for profound religious reasons that resist separation into neat categories. Understanding how Stonehenge was built and why it required more than observation and speculation, it demanded systematic investigation, careful excavation, scientific analysis, and the slow accumulation of evidence gathered by generations of archaeologists who approached the monument with increasing sophistication. Each decade brought new techniques, new questions, new ways of reading the landscape that revealed layers of meaning invisible to earlier observers. The investigation continues still, each season's work adding pieces to a puzzle that grows more complex and fascinating as more is discovered. Early excavations were crude by modern standards, more treasure hunting than careful archaeology. When stones fell or were re-erected, workers dug quickly with little documentation, searching for dramatic finds rather than systematically recording everything they uncovered. Artifacts were collected without careful note of their positions. Soil was discarded without being sifted or analysed. The emphasis was on objects, beautiful things that could be displayed in museums, not on the subtle evidence of construction techniques, ritual practices, or environmental conditions that modern archaeology values. William Gowland's excavation in 1901 marked a turning point. When he supervised the re-erection of a fallen sarsen stone, he treated the work as an archaeological opportunity, carefully documenting what he found, collecting samples, noting the precise position of artifacts. The antler picks he discovered in the stone hole provided the first solid evidence of Neolithic construction, tools that could be dated and that demonstrated the monument's builders possessed neither metal nor machinery, but only stone, bone, timber, and human muscle. The excavations of the 1920s and 50s went deeper, literally and figuratively. Richard Atkinson and his colleagues opened trenches across the site, revealing the monument's complex stratigraphy, the layers of construction and modification that accumulated over centuries. They discovered that the circular earthen bank and ditch were the earliest features, dating to around 3000 BC. Within this enclosure, the Aubrey holes formed a ring of pits that once held cremated human remains. Perhaps as many as 64 people buried over several centuries. This early phase made Stonehenge a cemetery, a sacred ground where chosen dead rested within the protective embrace of earth and community. Later investigations used techniques that would have seemed like magic to earlier archaeologists. Ground-penetrating radar mapped hidden features without digging. Geophysical surveys revealed buried structures across the surrounding landscape. Radiocarbon dating provided increasingly precise chronologies, pinning down when each construction phase occurred. Chemical analysis of human remains showed where people came from, what they ate, how they died. Laser scanning documented the stone surfaces with millimeter precision, revealing tool marks, ancient graffiti, and subtle shaping that earlier observers missed. The investigation expanded beyond the stone circle itself to encompass the entire sacred landscape. Archaeologists discovered that Stonehenge was never isolated, but formed the centre of a complex ceremonial area stretching for miles. The avenue, a parallel pair of banks and ditches, connected the monument to the River Avon 2 miles away, creating a processional approach aligned with the summer solstice sunrise. Nearby stood Woodhenge, a timber circle of comparable size and complexity. Durrington Walls, a massive henge enclosure, contained the remains of hundreds of houses where workers or pilgrims apparently lived during construction and ceremonial seasons. The cursus, a long rectangular earthwork, stretched for nearly 2 miles across the plain, its purpose still mysterious. Experimental archaeology provided insights that documents and excavation could not. Researchers attempted to move and erect stones using Neolithic tools and techniques, learning through doing what ancient builders knew. They discovered that massive stones could be moved on timber rollers or sledges, pulled by teams of dozens or hundreds working together with rope. They found that stones could be raised by digging sloping ramps and pivoting them into repaired holes, using timber scaffolding and counterweights. These experiments showed that nothing about Stonehenge's construction, required supernatural explanation or lost advanced technology. Only organization, determination, and knowledge passed from experienced workers to apprentices over generations. Scientific analysis of the stones themselves revealed surprising details. The sarsens, the large grey sandstones forming the outer circle and central trilithons, came from the Marlborough Downs about 20 miles north. The bluestones, smaller and darker, originated in the Preseli Mountains of southwest Wales, transported somehow across 140 miles of challenging terrain. Recent research suggests the bluestones may have first been erected at another site in Wales, then dismantled and brought to Salisbury Plain, carrying with them the sacred power of their original location. The stones were not randomly selected but carefully chosen, shaped, and prepared before being moved. Analysis of ancient bone and antler tools found in the excavations allowed researchers to date different construction phases with increasing precision. The monument emerged not from a single burst of inspiration, but through stages spanning 1,500 years. Around 3100 BC, the earthwork enclosure and Aubrey holes were created. Around 2600 BC, the bluestones arrived and were arranged in some configuration now hard to reconstruct. Around 2500 BC, the massive sarsen stones were erected in the iconic circle and horseshoe we recognize today. Around 2300 BC, the bluestones were rearranged into their current positions. Each phase represented massive effort by different generations who inherited, modified, and expanded what their ancestors began. The investigation taught archaeologists humility. Each answer raised new questions. Each technique revealed how much previous excavations had missed or misinterpreted. The monument that seemed simple from a distance, just a circle of standing stones, proved incredibly complex up close, the product of centuries of work and rework, of changing beliefs and evolving purposes, of communities who returned again and again to this sacred ground to add their own contributions to an ever-growing monument that would outlast their children's children's children. The physical evidence left at Stonehenge and in the surrounding landscape tells stories that documents never could. Fragments of a lost world that archaeologists pieced together with patience and scientific precision. Each artifact, each bone fragment, each tool mark on stone becomes a word in a language we slowly learn to read, revealing not just how the monument was built, but who built it and why, and what their lives were like during those centuries, when raising stones seemed more important than almost anything else. The antler picks found in stone holes remain some of the most moving artifacts. Made from red deer antlers, these tools were used to dig the chalk, to excavate the pits where stones would stand. The antlers show wear patterns, places where they were gripped, where they struck stone, where they broke from the force of repeated impacts. Radiocarbon dating of these tools provided the first reliable chronology for Stonehenge's construction. But beyond the dates, the antlers speak of human effort, of men and women who worked with tools that would break after hours of use, who dug pits 10 feet deep and 15 feet wide through solid chalk using only these organic implements, who understood that what they were building mattered more than comfort or convenience, or the wear on their bodies. The cremated human remains found throughout the site tell another kind of story. Analysis of these bone fragments reveals that at least 64 individuals were buried at Stonehenge over several centuries, possibly many more whose remains were removed or scattered by later activity. The cremations were not simple. Bodies were carefully burned at high temperatures, the ashes collected, sorted to remove bone fragments, then buried in specific locations within the monument. Some were placed in the Aubrey holes, others were scattered in the surrounding ditch. A few were found near standing stones, suggesting they were buried during construction ceremonies. Chemical analysis of these bones revealed where people came from. Isotope ratios in teeth and bone reflect the geology of the region, where someone spent their childhood, drinking local water, eating local food. Some individuals buried at Stonehenge grew up nearby, but others came from distant regions, from Wales, from Scotland, from continental Europe. These were not locals who happened to die near the monument, but people who travelled considerable distances to reach this place, suggesting Stonehenge drew pilgrims from across Britain and beyond, that its reputation spread far and that being buried here mattered enough for families to carry their dead across hundreds of miles. Several skeletons showed signs of disease, injury, or physical trauma. One man had a knee infection that must have caused constant pain. Another showed evidence of a head injury. Several had arthritis or dental abscesses. These findings contributed to theories about Stonehenge as a healing centre, though they might equally suggest that people who died while on pilgrimage were honoured with burial at the sacred site. The evidence admits multiple interpretations, as archaeological evidence often does. The stones themselves provide evidence through their surfaces and shaping. The Sarsen megaliths were dressed, shaped using stone hammers to create relatively smooth faces and regular forms. The work required enormous labour, striking the hard sarsen thousands of times to remove unwanted stone, creating tongues and grooves, tenons and mortices that locked the horizontal lintels to the vertical uprights. Some stones were shaped more carefully than others, suggesting different purposes or changing standards over the centuries of construction. Tool marks remain visible, documenting ancient techniques, and the painstaking care taken to create not just functional stones, but beautiful ones that pleased the eye and honoured the gods or ancestors they served. Pottery fragments scattered around the site date from various periods, showing that activity continued long after the main construction ended. Bronze Age people visited, perhaps to honour ancestors who built the monument. Iron Age people held ceremonies there. Romans came as tourists, carving their names. Medieval people collected fragments as holy relics. Each period left traces, layers of meaning accumulating like geological strata. The most dramatic evidence comes from nearby Durrington Walls, where excavations revealed the remains of a substantial settlement active during Stonehenge's main construction phases. Archaeologists uncovered hundreds of house floors, hearths and middens filled with animal bones and broken pottery. The bones showed that massive feasts occurred here, with cattle and pigs slaughtered and consumed in quantities suggesting gatherings of hundreds or thousands of people. The timing of these feasts, based on analysis of animal teeth, clustered around midwinter, suggesting that people gathered during the darkest part of the year for ceremonies and construction work. The feasting remains paint a vivid picture. People arrive from distant regions, bringing animals for slaughter, gathering in temporary houses built for the occasion. They worked on the monument together, perhaps pulling stones, digging ditches, raising trilithons. In the evenings they feasted, sharing food and drink, telling stories, making alliances, arranging marriages. The work of building Stonehenge was thus also the work of building community, creating social bonds that knit together otherwise isolated farming settlements scattered across the landscape. Artifacts found in the surrounding area include arrowheads, stone axes, and flint tools that travelled long distances. A polished jadeite axe found nearby came from the Alps, never used for work but carried as a precious object of display and prestige. Amber beads originated from the Baltic. These exotic items demonstrate that Neolithic Britain was not isolated but connected through exchange networks that stretched across Europe. Stonehenge stood at the centre of these networks, a place where different communities met, where ideas and goods and marriages moved between regions, where local became connected to distant in ways that enriched everyone involved. The evidence, when assembled, reveals a world more sophisticated and connected than simplified images of primitive Stone Age tribes suggest. These were people with complex beliefs, elaborate rituals, extensive trade relationships, and the organizational capacity to complete projects spanning many generations. The fragments they left behind, the bones and tools and shaped stones and feast remains, speak of human universals, the need for meaning, for connection, for creating something that endures beyond brief individual lives. Beneath the surface explanations, beneath the theories about astronomy and healing and ancestor worship, Stonehenge conceals mysteries that archaeologists only gradually recognized. The monument was never just a circle of standing stones, but the visible center of a vast sacred landscape that stretched for miles. A ceremonial complex whose full extent and meaning remain incompletely understood even now. What they never told us, what took decades to discover, was that Stonehenge was merely the heart of something far larger and stranger than earlier investigators imagined. The first hints came from aerial photography in the early 20th century. From the ground, the Salisbury Plain looks like rolling grassland marked by occasional earthworks. From above, patterns emerge invisible to observers walking the landscape. Crop marks, subtle variations in vegetation growth caused by buried features, revealed circles, lines, enclosures scattered across miles of apparently empty countryside. What seemed like isolated monuments proved to be parts of an interconnected ceremonial zone that transformed the entire plain into sacred ground. The cursus, discovered in the 18th century but not fully understood until much later, stretches for nearly 2 miles east to west just north of Stonehenge. It consists of parallel banks and ditches enclosing a long rectangular space, oriented towards sunrise on the May Day and Lammas Day cross-quarter festivals. Its purpose remains enigmatic. Some archaeologists suggest it was a processional way where communities gathered to race or parade during festivals. Others propose astronomical functions or connections with the journeys of the dead. The Cursus was built around 3600 BC, making it older than Stonehenge's stone circles, suggesting that this landscape was sacred long before the stones were raised. The avenue, connecting Stonehenge to the River Avon, served as a ceremonial approach aligned with the summer solstice sunrise. Walking the avenue toward the monument, pilgrims would see the sun rise directly through the stone circle's entrance at midsummer, a powerful visual and spiritual experience that made astronomy and religion inseparable. Recent excavations showed that the avenue follows natural periglacial stripes in the chalk, grooves left by Ice Age freeze-thaw cycles that coincidentally align with the solstice. Did ancient people notice this natural alignment and choose to build here because the land itself seemed to point towards sacred directions? Durrington Walls, excavated extensively in the 2000s, revealed a settlement much larger than previously recognised. The site contained not just scattered houses, but a planned village with streets, with separate areas for different activities, with timber circles as large as Stonehenge's stone circles. Analysis showed this settlement was occupied primarily in midwinter, opposite to the summer solstice celebrations at Stonehenge. Some archaeologists now propose that the two sites work together in a seasonal ritual cycle, Durrington Walls associated with the living, feasting and timber which burns and decays, Stonehenge associated with the dead, ancestors, and stone which endures forever. Woodhenge, standing between Durrington Walls and Stonehenge, consisted of 6 concentric rings of timber posts, perhaps supporting a roof or open to the sky. At its centre, excavators found the burial of a child whose skull had been split, possibly a sacrifice or perhaps just an honoured individual buried at a sacred location. The timber circles mirrored Stonehenge's stone circles, suggesting that wood and stone held different symbolic meanings, perhaps life and death, transience and permanence, earth and heaven. Scattered across the landscape are hundreds of burial mounds, barrows raised by Bronze Age people, centuries after Stonehenge was completed. These later communities chose to bury their dead within sight of the ancient monument, suggesting it retained sacred significance long after the people who built it were gone. The concentration of barrows around Stonehenge exceeds anywhere else in Britain, making the area one vast cemetery where generation after generation interred their elite, seeking connection with the deep past and the ancestors who built the stones. Recent excavations uncovered what might be the most significant discovery: the remains of a stone circle in the Preseli Mountains of Wales, the source of the bluestones. This Welsh circle, called Wanmorn, had stones of the same unusual cross-section as some of Stonehenge's bluestones. Several stone holes remained empty, their stones apparently removed. The circle's diameter matched the diameter of an early phase at Stonehenge. The alignment matched too. The evidence suggests that an entire stone circle was dismantled in Wales and transported to Salisbury Plain, bringing not just stones but the sacred power of a Welsh holy site to a new location. This discovery transformed understanding. If the bluestones came from a dismantled circle, their transport was not just an engineering challenge but a religious migration, comparable to moving a cathedral stone by stone to a new location. The bluestones carried with them the accumulated holiness of generations of Welsh ceremonies. Their placement at Stonehenge created a fusion of sacred geographies, linking distant regions in bonds deeper than trade or politics. The deeper mystery, then, is not just how or when Stonehenge was built, but why this particular place mattered so profoundly for so long. What made the Salisbury Plain sacred enough to draw people from hundreds of miles away? What beliefs motivated communities to invest generations of labour in expanding and elaborating monuments that no single lifetime would see completed? What spiritual experiences occurred here that justified the effort and sacrifice? Modern theories emphasise Stonehenge as a place between worlds, where boundaries dissolved. The solstice alignments marked moments when time pivoted, when the sun's journey reversed, when normal rules suspended. The combination of the living at Durrington Walls and the dead at Stonehenge suggested rituals that brought the two realms together. The transport of bluestones from Wales united distant landscapes. The gathering of communities from across Britain and beyond made the place a centre where local identities merged into something larger. The mystery deepens with each discovery, each excavation revealing how much remains unknown. We understand more about Stonehenge than ever before, yet the monument seems more mysterious now than when antiquarians first attempted to explain it. The deeper we dig, the more complex it becomes, layers of meaning accumulating like the soil that slowly covered abandoned stones, waiting patiently for someone to uncover them and wonder. Sometime around 2600 BC, something extraordinary happened on the Salisbury Plain. A decision was made that would transform not just the landscape but the entire social organisation of Neolithic Britain. Communities that had built the earthwork enclosure and buried their cremated dead in the Aubrey holes for centuries chose to embark on something unprecedented. To transport massive stones from distant sources and raise them into circles and horseshoes that would dominate the skyline forever. This was the turning point, the moment when Stonehenge changed from a cemetery and gathering place into something more ambitious, more permanent, more demanding of communal resources than any previous monument in Britain. The decision did not come suddenly. Archaeological evidence suggests decades or even generations of planning and preparation. Expeditions travelled to the Preseli Mountains in Wales, perhaps first to quarry small bluestones, later to dismantle and transport entire circles. Other groups identified the sarsen stones in the Marlborough Downs, massive boulders left on the surface by geological processes that made them sacred gifts from the earth itself. These expeditions were not simple resource gathering but pilgrimage, ritual journeys that connected distant sacred places and allowed different communities to participate in creating something larger than any one group could accomplish alone. Moving the stones required organisational capacity that transformed society. A community of a few hundred farmers working dispersed holdings could not suddenly divert labour to monument construction without planning for food surpluses, for temporary housing, for the tools and equipment needed. Someone had to coordinate the effort, not through coercive power necessarily, but through persuasion, through shared belief that what they were building mattered more than personal comfort. Religious leaders, people who could speak with authority about what the gods or ancestors required, must have played crucial roles in motivating the work. The engineering challenges were formidable. The largest sarsen stones weighed 50 tons, enormous masses of hard sandstone that had to be moved 20 miles across terrain that included valleys, rivers, and steep slopes. Modern experiments suggest that moving a 50-ton stone on rollers or sledges required teams of at least 200 people pulling together with rope, more if the ground was soft or sloped. The journey might take months, requiring camps along the route, food for the workers, replacement ropes and timbers as equipment wore out. This was not just construction, but expedition, adventure, ordeal that tested communities and forged bonds through shared struggle. Raising the stones presented different problems. Each sarsen had to be tipped into a prepared pit, using gravity and timber levers and counterweights to pivot the stone vertical. The pit's shape and depth had to be calculated precisely. Too shallow, and the stone would fall. Too deep, and it wouldn't stand at the right angle. As the stone pivoted down, teams pulled on ropes attached to its top to control the descent, preventing it from falling too fast and shattering. The final stage, getting the stone perfectly vertical and aligned with its neighbours, required careful adjustment using smaller stones as packing, wedging the megalith until it stood just right. The lintels posed the greatest challenge. These horizontal stones had to be lifted 20 feet in the air and placed precisely on top of the uprights, locked in place with carved tenons that fit into mortises on the lintel's underside. Archaeologists believe builders constructed earthen ramps or timber scaffolding, gradually raising the lintels using levers and platforms, inching them upward over days or weeks. The work required exceptional coordination, any mistake potentially fatal to workers below or catastrophic to the stones themselves. The turning point was not just technical, but psychological and spiritual. Committing to build Stonehenge's stone circles meant committing multiple generations to a project that would consume vast resources and labour. It meant accepting that those who began the work would never see it finished. that they were building for their grandchildren's grandchildren, trusting that future generations would honour the commitment and continue the work. This kind of long-term thinking, this ability to sacrifice immediate needs for distant goals, marked a profound shift in human consciousness. The decision also changed what Stonehenge meant. The earthwork enclosure and Aubrey holes had been important but impermanent, earth and timber that would erode and decay within centuries. Stone endured. Raising the megaliths declared that this place would be sacred forever, that the connection between living and dead, between earth and sky, between this community and the cosmos deserved permanent marking. The stones would outlast any individual, any family, any generation, becoming permanent features of the landscape that future communities would have to acknowledge and respect. This permanence created continuity. Each generation that worked on Stonehenge connected with their ancestors who began the work and their descendants who would complete it. The monument became a bridge across time, making the deep past present, making the distant future imaginable. Standing beside stones their great-grandparents raised, Neolithic people experienced time differently than we do, felt themselves part of chains of being that stretched backward and forward beyond individual mortality. The social effects were equally transformative. Building Stonehenge required cooperation on unprecedented scales. Communities that might otherwise compete for resources and territory had to work together, pooling labour and organising joint efforts. Religious and political leaders emerged who could coordinate these activities, who possessed the authority and vision to maintain the project across generations. The monument became a symbol of unity, proof that working together created something impossible for any group alone. The turning point thus represents more than stones being moved. It represents humanity choosing to create permanent marks on the landscape, to build something that would outlast memory, to declare that what we believe and value and honour deserves expression in material form that resists time's erosion. From this decision flowed everything else: the continued elaboration of Stonehenge, the construction of similar monuments across Britain and Europe, the development of increasingly complex societies, capable of organising labour and resources toward distant goals. The decision to raise Stonehenge's stone circle sent ripples across Neolithic Britain that transformed society in ways the original builders could not have anticipated. What began as a local monument became a regional pilgrimage centre, then a site of significance that drew people from across the British Isles and continental Europe. The consequences were not simple rise or fall, but complex transformations that elevated some communities while marginalising others, that created new forms of social organisation while disrupting older patterns, that connected distant peoples while sometimes intensifying differences between them. The most immediate consequence was the emergence of Stonehenge as a central place in ways unprecedented in Neolithic Britain. Previously, communities had been relatively egalitarian, small farming settlements scattered across the landscape with no clear hierarchies or permanent centres of power. Religious authority was diffuse, local shamans or elders conducting ceremonies without need for grand architecture. The construction of Stonehenge changed this, creating a location that demanded organisation, coordination, and the ability to mobilise labour across large regions. Those who controlled access to this sacred centre, who could speak for what the stones required or what the ancestors demanded, gained power and influence. Evidence suggests that Stonehenge became the focus of seasonal gatherings that dwarfed anything previously known in Britain. The feasting remains at Durrington Walls indicate celebrations involving thousands of people arriving from distant regions at specific times of year. This required planning, required leaders who could issue invitations or commands, required mechanisms for feeding and housing masses of people temporarily concentrated in one place. The logistics of such gatherings necessitated administrative capacities, people who could count and organise and allocate resources, who could mediate disputes and maintain order when diverse communities mixed. The monument's fame spread across Europe. Artefacts found at Stonehenge and nearby sites include materials from distant sources, amber from the Baltic, metals from Ireland, pottery styles from continental Europe. These objects arrived not through random trade, but through deliberate pilgrimage and exchange, people travelling to Stonehenge bringing offerings and gifts, seeking connection with this increasingly famous centre of sacred power. The site became, in modern terms, an international pilgrimage destination comparable to Mecca or Jerusalem, a place where being present for major ceremonies conferred prestige and spiritual benefit. This fame had costs. Communities living near Stonehenge found their landscape transformed by the influx of pilgrims and the demands of monument construction. Local resources, timber for rollers and scaffolding, grain to feed workers, animals for feast sacrifices, were consumed at rates that strained sustainability. The surrounding area shows evidence of deforestation as trees were cut for construction and fuel. Soil erosion increased as vegetation was cleared. The ecological impact of building and maintaining Stonehenge was significant, forcing communities to adapt their farming and resource management practices. Social hierarchies became more pronounced. Analysis of burials from this period shows increasing differentiation between elite individuals, buried with elaborate grave goods, and common people, interred with minimal ceremony. The Amesbury Archer, discovered near Stonehenge and dating to around 2300 BC, was buried with more than 100 objects including gold ornaments, copper knives, and arrows fletched with feathers from distant regions. This single burial contained more wealth than most communities accumulated in generations, suggesting the emergence of powerful individuals whose status derived partly from connection to Stonehenge and control over pilgrimage and ceremony. The rise of Stonehenge coincided with decline at other Neolithic centres. Monuments that had been important in earlier periods were abandoned or fell into disrepair, as attention and resources concentrated on the Salisbury Plain. This centralisation created winners and losers, communities who gained from proximity to the great centre and those marginalised by its growing dominance. Regional identities that had flourished when power was dispersed became subsumed into a broader identity focused on shared participation in Stonehenge's ceremonies. Yet the consequences were not purely hierarchical or oppressive. Stonehenge created bonds that crossed tribal and regional boundaries, allowing people who spoke different dialects or held slightly different beliefs to find common ground in shared ritual. The monument became a symbol of collective achievement, proof that cooperation could accomplish what seemed impossible. The stories told about building Stonehenge, passing from grandparents to grandchildren, created historical consciousness, a sense that their people had done great things and could do so again. The astronomical alignments took on greater significance as the monument's fame grew. The summer solstice sunrise through the avenue approach became a moment when thousands gathered to witness light flood through the stones in a perfect alignment that seemed to prove the builder's wisdom and power. These gatherings were not passive observation but active participation in cosmic renewal, the community joining with the sun to turn back the year's tide and begin the journey toward winter. The midwinter solstice, though less architecturally emphasized, may have been equally important, a moment of darkest night when the sun's return promised survival through cold months ahead. The construction techniques developed at Stonehenge spread across Britain and influenced monument building throughout the Atlantic coast of Europe. Megalithic traditions that had existed independently began incorporating elements of Stonehenge's design. The circle forms, the trilithon structures, the careful astronomical alignments. The monument became not just a pilgrimage centre, but a school where communities learned engineering and astronomical knowledge that they carried back to their homelands and applied to their own monuments. The consequence of raising Stonehenge was thus the creation of a new kind of society in Neolithic Britain, more hierarchical but also more connected, more capable of large-scale organisation, but also more dependent on central institutions, more conscious of itself as a people with shared identity and history. The monument that began as a cemetery and gathering place for local communities transformed into something that shaped British prehistory for over a millennium, creating social patterns and religious traditions that would persist through the Bronze Age and influence even the Iron Age cultures that followed. 5,000 years after the first stones were raised, Stonehenge continues to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle, influencing how we understand ancient societies, how we think about human capabilities, how we approach the past itself. The monument's impact extends far beyond archaeology into architecture, astronomy, spirituality, and the fundamental questions of what it means to be human and how we connect with those who came before us. Its influence radiates through time like the summer solstice light that still streams through the stones each June at dawn. The most immediate impact lies in transforming scholarly understanding of prehistoric societies. Before Stonehenge was properly dated and studied, the prevailing assumption held that sophistication flowed from literate civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the classical Mediterranean world. Prehistoric Europeans were imagined as primitive tribes barely capable of survival, let alone monumental construction or scientific observation. Stonehenge proved this assumption wrong. Here was evidence that Neolithic communities, without writing or metal or wheels, could organize massive labor forces, could observe astronomical phenomena with precision, could envision and execute projects spanning multiple generations. The monument forced a fundamental reconsideration of what defines civilization and what capabilities humans possess regardless of technological level. This reconsideration rippled through archaeology and anthropology. If Neolithic Europeans could build Stonehenge, what else might prehistoric peoples have accomplished that scholars dismissed or overlooked? The monument inspired more careful investigation of other prehistoric sites, more willingness to credit ancient peoples with intelligence and organizational capacity. The discovery of complex astronomical alignments at Neolithic sites across Europe, the recognition of trade networks stretching thousands of miles, the evidence of sophisticated social structures in seemingly simple farming communities, all followed from the intellectual opening that Stonehenge created. In architecture and engineering, Stonehenge stands as proof that sustainable construction, using local materials and human labour, can create structures that outlast steel and concrete. Modern architects studying the monument have learned about stability through mass, about the importance of careful foundation preparation, about how to work with rather than against natural forces. The post and lintel construction, with its carved joints that lock stones together without mortar, demonstrates engineering principles still relevant. The monument's survival through 5,000 years of weather, earthquakes, and human interference testifies to design wisdom that modern building sometimes forgets in pursuit of speed and economy. The astronomical significance of Stonehenge influenced the development of archaeoastronomy as a discipline, the study of how ancient peoples understood and marked celestial phenomena. Before Stonehenge's solstice alignments were properly documented, few scholars took seriously the idea that prehistoric peoples practiced systematic astronomy. The monument proved not only that they did, but that their observations were precise enough to align massive permanent structures with events occurring once or twice per year. This recognition led to studying other ancient sites for astronomical alignments, revealing that cultures worldwide developed sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles and incorporated that knowledge into their monuments and calendars. In popular culture, Stonehenge has become an icon representing mystery, ancient wisdom, and humanity's connection to the cosmos. It appears in films, novels, music, and art as a symbol of the unknown and unknowable past. This popularity sometimes distorts the monument's real history, encouraging speculation about lost civilizations or alien intervention that archaeological evidence does not support. Yet the fascination Stonehenge generates serves a positive purpose, inspiring wonder and curiosity about the past, drawing visitors to engage with archaeological sites, creating public support for preservation and research. The monument's influence on modern spiritual practices is complex and sometimes controversial. Neo-pagan groups adopted Stonehenge as a sacred site for their ceremonies, particularly solstice celebrations that draw thousands of participants. These modern rituals do not reflect Neolithic practices. We have no direct knowledge of what ceremonies occurred there 4,000 years ago, but they demonstrate the monument's continuing power to inspire spiritual connection. The debates over access, between those who see Stonehenge as heritage site requiring protection and those who view it as living temple deserving active use, reflect ongoing tensions between preservation and practice, between scientific study and religious experience. Stonehenge influenced heritage preservation policies worldwide. Its status as UNESCO World Heritage Site, its careful management balancing tourism with conservation, its controversies over road construction and visitor impacts, have all shaped how societies approach protecting archaeological resources while making them accessible to public. The lessons learned at Stonehenge about managing high-visibility heritage sites informed policies at monuments from Machu Picchu to Angkor Wat. The monument's impact on understanding human capability and motivation remains perhaps its most profound contribution. Stonehenge demonstrates that people will invest enormous effort in creating things that serve no immediate practical purpose, but fulfill spiritual, social, and aesthetic needs. The builders gained no economic benefit from raising the stones. The monument did not house them or store their grain or protect them from enemies. Yet they worked for generations to create it. suggesting that meaning and connection and beauty matter to human beings as much as shelter and food and safety. This understanding challenges purely materialist models of human behavior and reminds us that we are meaning-making creatures who need symbols and rituals and connections to something larger than ourselves. In education, Stonehenge serves as gateway to learning about prehistory, astronomy, archaeology, engineering, and cultural heritage. School children around the world study the monument, often as their first exposure to the Neolithic period and to the idea that ancient peoples were intelligent, capable, and creative. The monument makes prehistory tangible and interesting, inspiring some of those children to pursue careers in archaeology or related fields, ensuring future generations who will continue studying and protecting humanity's shared past. The impact ultimately lies in Stonehenge's demonstration that human beings have always been human, possessed of the same intelligence, creativity, emotional depth, and drive to create meaning that we recognize in ourselves. The monument connects us across immense spans of time to people whose lives were completely different from ours, yet whose fundamental nature was the same. They loved and grieved, wondered and created, worked together on projects that transcended individual lifetimes, left marks on the world that would endure after they were forgotten. In recognizing this, we see ourselves more clearly, understanding that 5,000 years is nothing compared to the depth of shared humanity. Beneath the architectural grandeur and astronomical precision, beneath the theories and excavations and measurements, Stonehenge was built by people whose names we will never know, whose faces we cannot see, whose voices were silenced by time but whose humanity speaks through the work they accomplished and the lives they lived while building something that would outlast them by millennia. These forgotten people deserve remembering, not as abstract labourers or statistics, but as individuals who laughed and wept, who felt pride and frustration, who watched their children grow up in the shadow of rising stones, and wondered what those children would remember about these years of extraordinary communal effort. Imagine the woman who woke at dawn, in a timber house at Durrington Walls, hearing her children stirring on sleeping platforms, the baby fussing, the older ones already awake and eager to see the day's work. She was perhaps 25 years old, middle-aged by Neolithic standards, her hands calloused from grinding grain and weaving cloth, and butchering the pig her family would contribute to tonight's feast. Her husband had left before light, joining the crews preparing to move another stone. She worried, as she worried every day during construction seasons, that something might go wrong, that a rope might break, or a roller slip, or the stone fall and crush someone she loved. Her morning tasks were the same as always despite the extraordinary things happening across the plain. Children needed feeding, barley porridge with honey if they were lucky, and the baby nursed while she worked, as efficient with time as any modern mother juggling demands. The clay pots by the hearth needed shaping for tonight's cooking, and there was wool to card, never enough hours to finish everything. But today was special. Today they would raise the stone, if the weather held and the gods were willing, and she wanted to be present for that moment even though it meant leaving tasks unfinished and asking her sister to watch the children. The work of building Stonehenge was not just men pulling ropes. Women prepared the massive quantities of food required to feed hundreds of workers. They brewed the beer and mead, consumed at celebrations when stones were successfully raised. They made the rope from plant fibres, tedious work requiring endless patience, as individual strands were twisted and plied into cables strong enough to pull stones weighing tons. They tanned hides and wove baskets and produced all the equipment workers needed. Without their labour, invisible in most archaeological discussions, construction would have been impossible. Think of the master stoneworker, perhaps 40 years old, his face weathered by decades of working in sun and wind, his body scarred from accidents that came with the profession. He had learned his craft from his father, who learned from his grandfather, techniques passing down through generations who perfected the art of shaping sarsen. He knew how to read stone, where it would split cleanly and where it would shatter. He understood the rhythm of striking with stone mauls, the pattern of blows that gradually shaped rough boulders into dressed megaliths. His expertise was crucial. The tongue and groove joints, the tenons and mortises that locked lintels to uprights, required precision that only experience could provide. He took pride in his work even as it exhausted him. Each stone he shaped was an offering, a gift to the ancestors and the gods in the community that trusted him with creating permanence from raw stone. He thought sometimes about his own grandfather who had shaped the first bluestones, working smaller stones with different textures and colours. He hoped his own grandchildren would remember him when they stood beside these Sarsens centuries hence, would know that their ancestors' hands had touched every surface, that his skill and care were embedded in stone that would outlast all memory of names and faces. There were the young people who saw Stonehenge rise during their lifetimes, perhaps the last generation to witness the final major construction phase. A teenage boy helped with everything, pulling ropes when stones moved, carrying water to workers, learning by watching and doing. He had been born in a world where the monument already stood partially complete, the circle begun but the trilithons not yet raised. His parents told stories of when the work started, of ceremonies and feasts and the great gathering when the first Sarsen was set upright. He would live to see it finished, would tell his own children about these years when gods and ancestors spoke through the work, guiding hands and blessing efforts. A young woman watched from the crowd when the central trilithon was raised, the tallest structure anyone had ever built, stones reaching toward the sky in a horseshoe embracing the rising midsummer sun. She held her mother's hand and felt tears on her cheeks, though she couldn't say why she wept. Perhaps it was the beauty of it, the impossible achievement, the way light would stream through that doorway for the rest of time. Perhaps it was sensing that she was present for something her descendants would speak of with wonder, that this moment would echo down generations as the day when everything came together perfectly. The elders who would not live to see completion carried their own mixture of pride and melancholy. An old priest walked the site leaning on a staff, his joints aching, his eyes dimming, knowing he would not witness the final stone. But he had kept the vision alive, had passed to younger priests the knowledge of alignments and rituals, had ensured continuity across his lifetime. He had presided over ceremonies honouring those who died during construction, accidents and illness that claimed lives even in service of sacred work. He had blessed marriages between families that met at Stonehenge gatherings, creating bonds that united communities across distances. His life's work was embedded in stone even if his name would be forgotten. There were migrants from Wales who came with the bluestones, families who decided to leave their homeland and settle near this new centre where their sacred stones now stood. They brought Welsh words and Welsh ways, intermarrying with local communities, creating cultural fusions that enriched everyone. Their children were bilingual, comfortable in two worlds, their identity shaped by multiple ancestries. They told stories of the journey, of bringing stones across mountains and rivers, adventures that became founding myths for their new community. And there were the dead, the cremated remains of 64 or more individuals whose ashes were buried at Stonehenge over centuries. Each was someone's parent, child, spouse, friend. Someone mourned and honoured by those who carried the cremated bones to rest within the sacred circle. Their voices are silent, but their presence made Stonehenge what it was, a bridge between living and dead, a place where ancestors dwelt among their descendants, watching, blessing, demanding remembrance. These forgotten voices speak through what they left behind, through the stones they shaped and raised, through the ceremonies they performed, through the community they built together. They were not abstract ancients, but people as fully human as we are, facing different challenges perhaps, but possessed of the same emotions, the same capacity for vision and effort and love, the same need to create meaning from their brief time alive beneath stars that burn forever. Not everyone embraced Stonehenge's rise. In any society, major transformations create winners and losers, enthusiasts and skeptics, those who benefit from change and those who resist it. The massive resources and labour required to build the monument, the centralisation of power and prestige it represented, the disruption it caused to established patterns of life, all generated opposition that left subtle traces in the archaeological record and shaped how Stonehenge evolved. Understanding this resistance reveals that Neolithic communities were not unified by simple shared belief, but divided by competing interests, different visions, and the human tendency to question authority even in age usually portrayed as religiously uniform. The evidence for resistance is indirect but suggestive. Some Neolithic monuments that had been important before Stonehenge's stone circles were raised fell into disrepair during the period of intensive construction. These sites were not far from Stonehenge, but distant enough that they represented different communities with their own local traditions and sacred places. The abandonment suggests that resources and attention were diverted to the great central monument, leaving regional centres without the labour and offerings they once received. Communities associated with these declining sites must have resented Stonehenge's growing dominance, must have mourned the loss of their own sacred landscape's importance. Archaeological surveys of the Salisbury Plain region show settlement patterns shifting during Stonehenge's main construction phases. Some areas that were densely populated earlier became less so, while areas near the monument saw increased activity. This suggests people were relocating, perhaps voluntarily to be near the action, perhaps under pressure as resources near Stonehenge became scarce, and communities further away were expected to contribute labour and goods without receiving immediate benefits. Such forced migrations breed resentment, create tensions between newcomers and established residents, foster conflict over resources and status. The construction process itself must have generated opposition. Modern experiments show that moving and raising stones required hundreds of people working in dangerous, exhausting conditions. Accidents happened. People died when ropes broke or stones slipped or scaffolding collapsed. Families who lost members to construction accidents may have questioned whether honouring ancestors and gods justified such costs. Religious authorities insisting on continued work despite casualties would have faced pushback from grieving parents and spouses who wondered if the monument was worth their loved ones' lives. The feasting requirements created economic pressures that likely sparked resistance. Feeding thousands of people at seasonal gatherings demanded surplus production from farming communities whose yields were never entirely predictable. Bad harvests meant choosing between feeding one's own family and contributing to the communal feasts. Some communities probably refused, claiming they couldn't spare food, forcing organisers to coerce or exclude them. These conflicts over resources must have strained relationships and created factions that questioned the entire enterprise. Evidence from skeletal remains shows violence in late Neolithic Britain, injuries consistent with warfare or interpersonal conflict that increased during the period of monument building. Some archaeologists interpret this as a result of competition for resources diverted to Stonehenge and other projects. Communities that refused to contribute might have been raided or attacked. Those forced to contribute beyond their capacity might have retaliated. The violence was not necessarily large-scale warfare, but probably low-level raiding and feuding that made life precarious for people already stressed by construction demands. Certain burials from this period show unusual features that might indicate dissent or exclusion. Some individuals were buried in ways that deviated from norms, facing wrong directions, lacking grave goods, interred in odd locations. These anomalous burials might represent people who opposed the monument, or who were punished for resistance, excluded from proper burial as statement against dissent. The practice of burying the dead speaks volumes about how society treats those who challenge authority. And the Neolithic was no exception to the human tendency to enforce conformity through ritual exclusion. There is evidence that some people left the region entirely rather than participate in Stonehenge's construction. Isotope analysis of bones from distant sites shows migrants from the Salisbury Plain arriving in Scotland, Ireland and elsewhere during the height of construction. These were not random wanderers, but possibly refugees or exiles, people who chose departure over compliance with demands they found excessive or beliefs they didn't share. Their migration suggests the monument created sufficient pressure that emigration seemed preferable to staying and resisting. Alternative religious practices persisted alongside the dominant Stonehenge-centred traditions. Excavations at sites contemporary with Stonehenge's main phases reveal burial practices and ceremonial structures that differ from patterns at the Great Monument. Some communities buried their dead in long barrows rather than cremating them. Others built timber circles with different orientations, marking different celestial events or honouring different aspects of the divine. These alternatives might represent conscious resistance, communities asserting their right to worship and build according to their own traditions rather than conforming to Stonehenge's increasingly dominant model. Within the community around Stonehenge itself, there were likely debates about how construction should proceed, which alignments mattered most, whose ancestors deserved primary honour. The monument went through multiple phases of construction and modification, sometimes undoing earlier work to rebuild in different configurations. This suggests changing opinions, factions with different visions gaining and losing influence, compromises between competing groups that each made their mark on the final structure. The bluestone rearrangements particularly suggest disagreements. Stones moved and remounted multiple times as if communities couldn't agree on proper placement. The opposition to Stonehenge reveals that Neolithic society was not simple or uniform but complex and contested, that major monuments were built not through universal consensus but through negotiation, pressure, resistance, and the exercise of power by those who controlled religious authority and could claim to speak for ancestors and gods. The monument's grandeur should not blind us to the human costs, the conflicts, the people who said no, or who complied reluctantly, or who were forced against their will to contribute labour and resources to something they didn't believe in. This opposition makes Stonehenge more interesting, not less. It shows that the achievement was not inevitable, that it required convincing skeptics, overcoming resistance, maintaining momentum across generations despite doubts and conflicts. The monument stands today partly because enough people believed in it to keep working despite opposition, to continue the project through setbacks and tragedies and the inevitable human tendency to question whether extraordinary efforts serve purposes that justify their costs. That it was built at all, against both practical obstacles and human resistance, testifies to the power of shared vision and the ability of communities to accomplish together what no individual could achieve alone. Around 2500 BC, as the final major construction phase neared completion, something remarkable occurred across Neolithic Britain and beyond. The period of Stonehenge's culmination coincided with a flowering of artistic expression, technological innovation, and cultural exchange that transformed societies throughout northwestern Europe. This was not mere coincidence, but consequence, the monument serving as catalyst for a cultural awakening that spread from the Salisbury Plain in ripples of influence that touched communities hundreds of miles away. The stone circle's completion marked not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a brief but brilliant cultural renaissance. The most visible evidence appears in the sudden proliferation of elaborate stone circles across Britain and Ireland. Communities that had watched Stonehenge rise wanted their own monuments, their own connections between earth and sky, their own permanent statements in stone. Avebury, the massive complex just north of Stonehenge, was constructed or elaborated during this period, creating a landscape of sacred circles even more extensive than Stonehenge itself. Silbury Hill, a massive artificial mound requiring even more labour than the stone circles, rose on the same plain, its purpose still mysterious but its message clear. People here could shape Earth itself according to vision and will. In Scotland, the Orkney Islands saw extraordinary architectural development. Settlements like Skara Brae, with their sophisticated stone houses and elaborate drainage systems, demonstrated advances in domestic architecture. The nearby stone circles and chambered tombs of Orkney incorporated astronomical alignments and engineering techniques influenced by developments at Stonehenge. The Ring of Brodgar and Standing Stones of Steenis rivaled southern monuments in scale and precision, suggesting that knowledge and ambition flowed north through networks of exchange and pilgrimage that Stonehenge helped create. Artistic expression flourished in forms both monumental and intimate. Pottery from this period shows increasingly elaborate decoration, complex geometric patterns that might encode astronomical knowledge or cosmological beliefs. Carved stone balls, unique to Scotland, display symmetry and craftsmanship that serve no obvious practical purpose but demonstrate dedication to beauty for its own sake. Rock art panels across Britain and Ireland depict spirals, cups, rings, and abstract symbols whose meanings remain mysterious, but whose execution required patient labour by artists who cared deeply about creating something beautiful and potentially sacred. Technological innovations accelerated. Metalworking, which had been rare and limited to small copper ornaments, expanded as Bronze Age culture developed in Britain. The Amesbury archer, buried near Stonehenge with gold ornaments and copper knives, represents this transition, his wealth and exotic artifacts suggesting he was metalworker or trader who gained status through controlling new technologies. Metal tools, superior to stone for many purposes, began supplementing and eventually replacing the stone implements that had served for millennia. This technological shift was cultural as much as practical, marking Britain's fuller integration into European networks of trade and innovation. The exchange networks themselves intensified. Amber from the Baltic appears in British graves with increasing frequency. Irish gold reaches continental Europe. Pottery styles spread across regions, suggesting not just trade in objects but movement of people carrying ideas and techniques. Beaker pottery, named for its distinctive drinking vessels, appears across Western Europe in graves often associated with high-status individuals, possibly representing a new cultural identity that transcended local tribal affiliations. These Beaker people, whoever they were, may have been drawn to Stonehenge as pilgrims and missionaries, spreading their own beliefs while absorbing influences from the monument's traditions. Agricultural practices evolved to support larger populations and more complex social organization. Evidence suggests experimentation with different crops, development of storage techniques that allowed accumulating surplus, intensification of animal husbandry to provide the massive meat requirements of ceremonial feasts. These developments were practical necessities but also cultural achievements, demonstrating that communities could master their environment well enough to produce not just survival, but abundance for religious and artistic purposes. The astronomical knowledge embedded in Stonehenge appears to have spread as communities elsewhere built monuments with similar alignments. The sophistication required to identify solstice points on the horizon, to calculate where stones must stand to frame those events, to maintain that knowledge across generations, suggests that priestly classes developed educational systems for preserving and transmitting specialized knowledge. This may represent the beginning of formal education in Britain, teachers and students gathering to learn techniques of observation, measurement and calculation that would define priesthood as distinct profession, requiring years of training. Social structures became more complex and formalized. The wealth disparities evident in burials suggest that class distinction solidified, that hereditary elites emerged whose status derived partly from controlling access to Stonehenge and its ceremonies. Yet this hierarchy apparently functioned through consensus more than coercion, elites maintaining position by organizing successful ceremonies, ensuring favorable harvests, providing feast hospitality, demonstrating connection to ancestors and gods. The Cultural Renaissance depended on these leaders who could coordinate complex activities and maintain the religious traditions that justified their authority. The awakening was intellectual as much as material. Stonehenge demonstrated that human beings could understand cosmic patterns and create permanent marks aligned with those patterns. This revelation must have sparked philosophical questions about humanity's place in the universe, about the relationship between earthly and celestial realms, about whether time was linear or cyclical. The monument's solstice alignments implied cyclical time, eternal return, the sun travelling the same path forever. This cosmology shaped how people understood their lives, suggesting that what mattered was not individual achievement but continuity, maintaining connections with ancestors, ensuring future generations would remember and honour what came before. The cultural renaissance that accompanied Stonehenge's completion was brief, perhaps lasting only a few centuries before Bronze Age transformations brought different social structures and new concerns. But while it lasted, this awakening produced monuments, art, technologies, and ideas that shaped northwestern Europe for millennia. It was a moment when human creativity and collective effort aligned to produce something approaching greatness, when communities proved capable of transcending immediate survival needs to pursue beauty, meaning, and connection with forces larger than themselves. The stones remain as testament to that awakening, silent witnesses to a time when anything seemed possible, and the sky itself bent down to touch the earth. After more than a century of excavation and analysis, after all the theories and debates and careful sifting of evidence, archaeologists have reached a consensus about what Stonehenge fundamentally was, a truth that redefines our understanding of the monument and reveals something profound about the people who built it. Stonehenge was primarily a domain of the dead, a threshold between worlds where ancestors dwelt among the living, where the boundaries separating earthly existence from whatever lay beyond grew thin enough that communication and connection became possible. This revelation transforms how we see the stones, not as astronomical observatory or healing temple or gathering place, though it was all those things, but as necropolis, ancestral shrine, gateway to the realm of the dead. The evidence accumulated slowly. Excavations throughout the 20th century repeatedly encountered cremated human remains, first in the Aubrey holes, then scattered through the ditch, eventually discovered near standing stones and in areas previously thought empty of burials. Radiocarbon dating showed these cremations spanned centuries, from the monument's earliest phases through its period of maximum elaboration. Chemical analysis revealed that at least 64 individuals were buried there, possibly many more whose remains were scattered or removed. These were not random deaths, but deliberate burials. People chosen for interment at this sacred location, their ashes carefully collected after cremation and placed with ceremony. Who were these dead? The cremation process destroys much information, but enough survived for analysis. They included men, women and children, families rather than just elite males. Some showed signs of wealth in the few objects buried with them. Others were interred without grave goods. What united them was not social status but something else. Perhaps descent from founding families, perhaps religious significance, perhaps simply the honour of being remembered at this most sacred of places. Their burial at Stonehenge conferred on them a kind of immortality, their names forgotten but their presence enduring as long as stones stood. The architecture supports this interpretation. The monument's careful alignments with solstices take on different meaning when understood as concerning death rather than just astronomy. Many cultures associate the sun's annual journey with the cycle of life and death, the waxing and waning year metaphor for human existence. The winter solstice, when the sun reaches its lowest point and daylight shrinks to minimum, represents death or the approach of death. The summer solstice, maximum daylight and solar power, represents life at its fullest. Stonehenge marked both transitions, suggesting it was concerned with the entire cycle, with death's inevitability and life's renewal, with the hope that just as the sun returns from its winter nadir, so too might the dead return or be reborn. The monument's location reinforces this interpretation. It sits on high ground visible for miles, making it a prominent feature of the landscape that would remind people daily of their ancestors and obligations to the dead. Yet it is not so remote that reaching it required arduous journey. The plain was regularly traversed by Neolithic communities. This accessibility mattered because the dead needed tending, needed regular visits from descendants who brought offerings, performed ceremonies, maintained relationships that death did not sever. Stonehenge was not isolated cemetery, but active shrine where living and dead mingled. The surrounding landscape, once seen as separate monuments, now appears as unified necropolis. The barrows scattered across the plain were later additions, but they cluster near Stonehenge, suggesting the area's association with death persisted for millennia. The timber circles at Durrington Walls and Woodhenge may have been associated with life, with feasting and celebration, with the living world of decay and renewal represented by wood that grows and rots. Stonehenge's stone circles represented death and eternity, the permanent and unchanging realm where ancestors dwelt. The two sites worked together in ritual cycles that honoured both life and death, recognising that neither exists without the other. This revelation challenges romantic notions about Stonehenge as primarily astronomical or scientific. Yes, the alignments are precise and required sophisticated observation. But that precision served religious purposes, creating moments when cosmic order and human ritual perfectly aligned, when the rising sun illuminated stones and ancestors simultaneously, when the boundary between mundane time and sacred time dissolved. The astronomy was in service to theology, not separate from it, the sky itself part of the sacred landscape where gods and ancestors moved. Understanding Stonehenge as domain of the dead also explains its evolution over centuries. Each generation added to the monument not just to improve its astronomical functions, but to accommodate more dead, to honour their particular ancestors, to ensure their own eventual memorialisation. The modifications and rebuildings that archaeologists document were not random but purposeful. Communities adapting the monument to changing beliefs about death and afterlife while maintaining continuity with what ancestors had begun. The revelation is not that Stonehenge was cemetery, that was known, but that being cemetery was its primary purpose, that everything else flowed from this central function. It was a place where death was not feared as ending but honoured as transformation, where the dead did not disappear but remained present and powerful, watching over descendants, blessing or cursing as those descendants honoured or neglected their obligations. Building Stonehenge was thus an act of profound faith, belief that creating this permanent shrine would ensure that the community's dead would endure as the stones endured, that memory would survive as long as stone remained standing. This understanding makes Stonehenge simultaneously more familiar and more alien. More familiar because every culture creates places for honouring the dead, cemeteries and memorials and shrines that serve similar purposes. More alien because the Neolithic relationship with death differed from ours, cremation and communal burial suggesting beliefs about identity and afterlife that modern individualism struggles to comprehend. The dead at Stonehenge were not individuals resting separately, but community members joining an ancestral collective, their individual identities merging into the larger identity of the people who built the stones. The deepest historical truth Stonehenge reveals is that ancient people face the same existential questions we do about mortality and meaning, about whether death ends everything or transforms it into something else. Their answer, encoded in stone circles raised at immense cost and maintained over millennia, was that the dead matter, that ancestors deserve honour, that the boundary between life and death can be bridged through ritual and remembrance, and permanent marking of sacred space where both worlds touch. This answer may not satisfy modern skeptics, but its sincerity and the effort invested in expressing it through stone deserves respect and contemplation as we stand where they stood, looking at the same stars, wondering the same eternal questions. Standing at Stonehenge today, watching tourists photograph the stones and archaeologists continue their patient work, feeling the wind that has blown across this plain for 5,000 years, it becomes necessary to ask what this ancient monument means for us, for our time, for our understanding of who we are and where we fit in the long arc of human history. The stones are not just archaeological curiosities or tourist attractions, but mirrors reflecting back truths about human nature that remain constant despite everything that changes, truths about our need for meaning, for connection, for creating something that transcends the brief span of individual existence. Stonehenge teaches first about time's nature and how we experience it. The monument was built over 1,500 years, a span equivalent to the entire period from fall of Rome to present day. Imagine proposing a construction project today that wouldn't be completed until the 45th century, that your great-great-great-grandchildren's descendants might see finished. We cannot imagine such commitment because modernity teaches us to think in shorter timeframes, quarterly reports and election cycles, and 5-year plans. Stonehenge reminds us that humans are capable of thinking in generations, of starting work knowing we'll never see completion, trusting that future generations will honour our vision and continue what we began. This kind of thinking, this ability to sacrifice immediate gratification for distant goals, challenges our present obsession with instant results and short-term thinking. The monument speaks to human capability and what we can accomplish when working together towards shared purposes. The engineering and organisational challenges of building Stonehenge would be significant today with modern equipment and technology. That Neolithic communities accomplished this with stone tools and human muscle, and wooden rollers demonstrates that intelligence and determination are not products of technology, but fundamental human traits that transcend historical period. We often assume progress moves in straight lines, that people become progressively smarter and more capable. Stonehenge proves this assumption false. The builders were as intelligent as we are, as creative, as capable of complex planning and sustained effort. They lacked our tools but not our fundamental capacities. Stonehenge reflects our universal need for beauty and meaning. The monument serves no practical purpose, doesn't house anyone or store grain or defend against enemies. It exists because humans need more than survival, need to create things that are beautiful and meaningful, need to express through permanent form our beliefs about cosmos and death, and our place in the eternal patterns of existence. This need is not luxury or excess, but fundamental to being human. Modern society sometimes forgets this, treating art and ritual and spiritual practice as optional extras rather than essentials. Stonehenge argues otherwise, demonstrating that even when life was harder and resources scarcer, people invested enormous effort in creating beauty and meaning. The monument teaches about continuity and how societies maintain identity across generations. Stonehenge connected builders with their ancestors and with descendants they would never meet, creating chains of being that stretched backward and forward beyond individual mortality. This continuity provided stability, sense of purpose, understanding that lives gained meaning through participation in something larger and more enduring than oneself. Modern mobility and individualism often sever these connections, leaving people unmoored, searching for identity and purpose without the anchoring weight of ancestors and obligations to future generations. Stonehenge reminds us what we lose when we forget that we are links in chains, receivers of traditions we did not create, and transmitters of inheritance we will not fully shape. Stonehenge speaks to the importance of ritual and ceremony in human life. The monument was designed for ceremonial purposes, for marking solstices and honouring the dead and gathering communities for shared experiences that reinforced bonds and beliefs. Modern secular society often dismisses ritual as empty formality or religious superstition. Yet humans need ritual, need repeated practices that mark important transitions and create shared experiences and connect everyday existence to something larger. The persistence of people gathering at Stonehenge for solstice celebrations 5,000 years after it was built suggests that this need remains constant regardless of changing beliefs. The monument reflects our complex relationship with death and ancestors. Stonehenge was built to honour the dead, to maintain connection with ancestors, to ensure that death did not sever family bonds or erase the deceased from community memory. Modern culture often treats death as ending, something to be hidden in hospitals and funeral homes, something not to be dwelt upon or publicly displayed. This creates loss, severing connections with those who came before, forgetting that identity is multi-generational, that who we are owes everything to ancestors who lived and died to make our existence possible. Stonehenge argues for a different approach, treating death as transformation rather than ending, maintaining active relationships with the dead, honouring ancestors as continuing presences rather than mere memories. Stonehenge teaches about the limits of knowledge and the importance of mystery. Despite centuries of study, despite sophisticated techniques and exhaustive excavation, we still do not fully understand the monument. We know when it was built and roughly how, and we can infer some of its purposes, but the beliefs that motivated its construction, the ceremonies performed there, the spiritual experiences people had when standing among the stones remain largely mysterious. This mystery is not failure of archaeology, but reminder that some knowledge cannot be recovered, that past people's inner lives are ultimately unknowable, however much we learn about their material culture. This limitation should inspire humility, recognition that our interpretations are always provisional, always shaped by our own cultural assumptions and limitations. The monument reflects the power and danger of centralized institutions. Stonehenge's construction required concentrating resources and authority, creating hierarchies and specialized priesthoods that gained power through controlling access to sacred places and practices. This concentration enabled the monument's construction, but also created inequalities, forced labor, resistance from those who bore costs without receiving benefits. The pattern persists today whenever societies build grand projects, the tension between achievement and exploitation, between collective benefit and unequal burden. Stonehenge reminds us that this tension is not new, that even in societies we imagine as simple, the same ethical questions arose about how to balance collective good against individual cost. Finally, Stonehenge means that we're not alone in our struggles to create meaning and connection. The people who built it face the same existential questions we face about why we exist. What happens after death? How to create significance from temporary existence on indifferent Earth beneath vast cosmos? Their answer, creating permanent monument that would outlast memory of their names, may not be our answer, but it deserves respect, a sincere attempt to solve problems that have no perfect solutions. Standing where they stood, looking up at stones they raised, we connect across 5 millennia with people as human as we are, as uncertain, as hopeful, as determined to leave marks on the world that might matter, that might endure, that might whisper across ages to whoever comes after. We were here, we lived, we built this. Remember us. The sun rises over Stonehenge as it has for 5,000 years, light streaming through the stones at midsummer dawn in perfect alignment that still functions despite millennia of weather and earthquake and human interference. The monument stands, weathered but enduring, stones that will outlast our civilization as they outlasted the one that built them. This is Stonehenge's ultimate legacy, not what it meant to Neolithic builders or what it reveals to modern archaeologists, but simply that it endures, that human beings created something permanent in a temporary world, that stone remembers when memory fails. The monument's physical survival is remarkable. Many stones have fallen, their collapse documented over centuries, victims of storms or destabilization by treasure hunters or simple erosion of their foundations, yet most remain standing, the great trilithon still framing sky. the circle still visible despite gaps, the heel stone still leaning at its odd angle outside the entrance. Modern conservation efforts ensure that what remains will be preserved for future generations, though this creates philosophical questions about how much intervention is appropriate, whether fallen stones should be re-erected or left as they fell, whether the site should be allowed to continue its natural decay or be frozen in current state. The surrounding landscape tells its own story of change and continuity. The barrows remain, though many were excavated in the 19th century, and their contents removed to museums. The avenue still approaches from the northeast, though it's now visible mainly as crop marks rather than earthen banks. Durrington Walls endures a subtle earthwork feature that casual visitors might not notice without guidance. The cursus stretches across the plain, mysterious as ever. Modern roads cut through the sacred landscape, traffic noise replacing the silence Neolithic people experienced. Plans for tunnelling the main road underground sparked fierce debates about balancing access with preservation, about whether the monument matters more for what it was or what it means to contemporary people. The legacy lives also in the thousands of visitors who come each year, drawn by fame and mystery, and the desire to experience directly what photographs cannot capture. They arrive with varied motivations, some tourists checking off bucket list item, some pilgrims seeking spiritual connection, some scholars pursuing research questions, some simply curious about the past and what it reveals about being human. The monument affects them differently. Some moved to tears by the stone's presence, others underwhelmed by reality compared to imagination, most falling somewhere between, impressed but also aware of centuries separating them from the builder's intentions and experiences. The solstice gatherings demonstrate Stonehenge's continuing power over imagination and spiritual practice. Thousands assemble at midsummer dawn and midwinter dusk, when the sun rises or sets in alignment with the stones, when the ancient purpose still functions. These modern ceremonies blend neo-pagan ritual with folk tradition and simple desire to mark seasonal turning points. The participants are not Neolithic communities, but they respond to same human needs for ceremony and connection, and witnessing cosmic patterns that motivated the original builders. The gatherings create controversy, debates about appropriate use versus preservation, about who owns heritage and whether monuments should be active sites or protected relics. The legacy extends through influence on subsequent generations, who built their own monuments in Stonehenge's shadow. Bronze Age barrows cluster around the stones, their builders choosing proximity to ancient power, even when the original purpose was forgotten. Iron Age people visited, perhaps conducting their own ceremonies or simply marvelling at ancestors' achievement. Romans came as tourists, carving names into stones as later visitors would, leaving marks that add layers to the monument's story. Medieval people wove legends around the stones, attributing them to Merlin's magic or giant strength, stories that preserved wonder when historical fact was lost. The scholarly legacy is equally rich. Generations of archaeologists built careers studying Stonehenge, each contributing pieces to the slowly assembled understanding. The development of radiocarbon dating, archaeoastronomy, isotope analysis, geophysical survey, and countless other techniques were advanced or refined through work at this site. Students learned excavation methods here. Theories were proposed, tested, refined, discarded, replaced by better theories that will themselves eventually be superseded. The monument continues teaching, each season's work revealing new details that complicate and enrich understanding. In popular culture, Stonehenge has become an icon representing ancient mystery and vanished wisdom. It appears in films and novels usually inaccurately, attributed to aliens or druids or lost civilizations, given powers it never possessed. This misuse frustrates archaeologists but perhaps serves a useful purpose, keeping the monument in public consciousness, ensuring people care enough about it to support preservation, even if their understanding is sometimes wrong. The challenge is balancing romantic imagination with historical accuracy, allowing wonder without encouraging nonsense. The deeper legacy may be what Stonehenge teaches about human nature, and what remains constant despite technological and social change. The builders face same existential questions we face about mortality and meaning, about how to create significance from temporary existence, about how to honour those who came before and provide for those who come after. Their solution was building in stone, creating permanent monuments that would outlast empires and languages and the very memory of their names. 5,000 years later, their solution endures, the stones still standing, still marking solstices, still drawing pilgrims and scholars and tourists and dreamers. We build differently now, in steel and glass and concrete, structures designed for decades, not millennia. We think differently, in shorter time frames with different assumptions about progress and change. Yet standing at Stonehenge, feeling the same wind that blew when the stones were new, watching the same sun trace the same path across the same sky, it becomes clear that some things do not change. We are still the people who built Stonehenge, still capable of the same vision and determination, still possessed of the same need for beauty and meaning and connection with something larger than ourselves. The stones remind us of this, standing patient and permanent beneath ancient skies, waiting for however many more thousands of years they will endure, silent witnesses to human dreams that reach toward eternity, and, in stone at least, succeeded. The legacy is simple in the end. They built something that lasted. They created meaning that endures. They left marks on the earth that whisper across millennia. We were here. We lived. We mattered. And in hearing that whisper, in standing where they stood and wondering what they wondered, we connect across impossible distance and time to our shared humanity, to the eternal questions and hopes and fears that make us human regardless of when or where or how we live. The stones stand, the sun rises, the story continues chapter after chapter, generation after generation, as long as anyone cares to listen and remember,